process of signing off. My name's Chris Alderson, so I'm the CE at Construction Health and Safety in New Zealand. And we're really interested, excited, curious about what our two guests are going to be talking to us today. So we have been communicating both with Helen and Michelle over the last 6 months about various construction-related issues that we're seeing, particularly in Australia. And of course, we always learn a lot from different parts of the world and anybody doing research, particularly around construction, health and safety. And we very much, encourage the investment and respect the investment that various researchers around the world are making in this area. It's really important. So we're going to have around about 30 to 40 minutes today with Helen and Michelle talking through essentially their new book. So they have written a book recently, which again is called Work, Health and Wellbeing in the Construction Industry. It's available on Amazon and various other places, wherever you get your books. I think we've got about 5 copies in CHASNZ now because we found it a really good read. So we would encourage people to follow up on that, and we'll include it in the links when we actually post this webinar next week. So, of course, we do record these webinars, and that will be available next week with the presentation as well. We are happy to take questions probably towards the end of the session. I'd encourage you to use the Q&A function within Zoom to post your questions on there, and we'll attempt to get as many covered as possible during the course of the webinar. But if we don't cover them specifically, we'll try and cover them afterwards in writing as well and get back to you. So look, I'll make an introduction here. I will stop sharing for a minute so we can go big. We have here Dr. Helen Lingard. So Helen Lingard is from the RMIT in Melbourne. She's a distinguished professor and director of the Centre for Construction Work, Health and Safety. Sorry, I'm just playing with my screens here. Health and Safety Research at RMIT University, Melbourne. Helen's been an active researcher in the field of construction work, health and safety for more than 20 years. And with her is Michelle Turner. She's an associate professor at the School of Property Construction and Project Management, member of the Construction Work, Health and Safety Research at RMIT University, and co-leads the Health and Wellbeing stream within Helen's team. Michelle's got more than 15 years worth of experience working with the construction industry in a capacity as health, wellbeing and resilience researcher. So I'll hand over to both Michelle and Helen in a second, and I will just make sure we've got our sharing back on, and we'll go back to our presentation. So look, thank you very much for doing this today. Hopefully you can see the presentation, Helen. Thumbs up. Great, excellent. I will now hand over to yourselves.
Okay, thank you very much, Chris, and it's a pleasure to be here. If we could have the next slide, please, we'll might as well get into it. Oh, I think we've missed the photo of the book, which I just wanted to say, Michelle and I, when we embarked on writing this book a few years ago, pre-COVID now, took quite a while to complete. It was based on research that we'd been doing and lots of conversations that we'd had about the need to focus on primary interventions in construction industry, i.e. solutions that change job conditions and characteristics of work, rather than just focus on changing workers' lifestyles. And this was something we'd observed in our research over a period of time, and we decided that it was really an important thing to try and communicate in this book. So you'll find, if you have a look at the book, that's a common theme through all of the chapters in the book. Next slide, maybe next one. Okay, so just a bit about the structure of the presentation. We're first going to cover issues around work hours and the impact of work hours on health. We're then going to talk about a related project in the construction industry in Australia, which is the Culture in Construction Initiative. I'm then going to hand over to Michelle, who's going to talk a little bit about young workers and health, and then a little bit about gender, and in particular, the impacts of working in the construction industry on women. And then finally, I'll take over again and introduce a piece of work we've done, which tries to produce work contexts in construction that promote positive health and well-being. So that's what we'll cover off today. So first up, work hours. So there's a whole chapter on work hours in the book, and I'll just outline why that is. If we can have the next slide, Chris, thanks. So some time ago, we wanted to put a submission to the Australian Government Productivity Commission about the impact of the culture of the industry on health and productivity. And we interviewed, I think, 9 CEOs and very senior government people, so really industry leaders, about what they thought the industry was like. And they told us some really shocking things. So some of these people, there's some quotes here, they talked about mental health episodes being something that they see on their projects due to extreme pressures. They talked about the pressure and the long work hours. And while the industry is great because you do things that are interesting, there's this pressure and these long work hours that really take their toll on people in construction. And then they talked about the culture of the industry being not a culture within which people could seek help or talk about any issues that they might be experiencing. So this final quote here, a CEO of a large construction company said, "It's not okay to say I'm not okay. Take a teaspoon of concrete and harden up," is the masculine culture of the industry, and that exacerbates the issues that we're seeing. So on the issues of long work hours, this is pretty old data. It's data we collected, I don't know, many years ago now. I suspect it's the same, if not worse. So we asked people how many hours they worked on average a week. And you can see people on site in direct construction activity said they were working on average 63 hours a week, in a site office working 56, and in a company office 49. As I said, I think the industry's intensified, and we do see people now reporting that they're working, sometimes up to 80 hours or more a week. So this data is old. It may be similar, maybe even potentially slightly worse now. We don't know. We haven't asked the question more recently, but notwithstanding that, these are long hours. Australia has a national employment standard of 38 hours a week, just to put these in perspective. However, the national employment standard does say that these hours, the 38 hours, can be extended if it doesn't affect health or safety. The problem we have, of course, is that we know long hours do affect health and safety. And so, for example, a piece of research that was done in Australia a few years ago by colleagues at the Australian National University used a large population based longitudinal study to look at work hours and mental health in all industries, not just construction. And they identified the tipping point. So they found in their study that working is good for people up to a certain point. So working is generally better for people's mental health than being unemployed up to a certain point. But there's a point at which work hours become harmful. And that tipping point across the average population, men, women of all ages, was 39 hours a week. And if you take that tipping point as being 39, you can actually see that when you're working in the construction industry, you're working hours in excess of that tipping point. Another piece of work that's come out relatively recently that's worth mentioning is the World Health Organization and International Labour Organization joint estimates report of the burden of work-related disease and injury. And it's a global monitoring report that they produced in 2021. Now, that report found that 4,888 million people worldwide work long hours. And in 2006, more than 745,000 people died from heart disease or stroke related to working more than 55 hours a week. Moreover, they actually found that working 55 hours or more per week was associated with an estimated 35% higher risk of stroke and 17% higher risk of dying from heart disease compared to working 35 to 40 hours a week. In the US, research has shown that extended work hours also increase the risk of workplace injury. So if you're working more than a 12-hour day, you're at an increased risk of injury of more than 37% greater. And if you're working more than 60 hours a week, your risk of injury is actually increased by 23%. So we need to be concerned about work hours in construction. And what this is all telling us is that the hours that people are working at the moment is likely to be harmful to their health and also their safety. Next slide, please. So some mechanisms of influence and looking at why long hours affect health. It reduces the time you have to recover from work. So if you're working long hours, and in construction, we see people working regular weekend work, they only maybe have 1 day a week off. They have less time to recover, and recovery or lack of recovery is detrimental to health. Because they're at work longer, they have longer exposure to work-related hazards, both physical and psychological. And they also experience a high level of interference with time spent in non-work activities. And we know that there's a really strong relationship between, for example, work negatively affecting family life and a whole range of physical and mental health outcomes. Next slide, please. So our research in Australia actually shows that work-family conflict, which I mentioned before, is related to long hours. So when you work long hours, your work adversely interferes with relationships, leisure time, home management, and so on. And in fact, that interference with life outside of work is a direct pathway through which long hours actually produce worker burnout. What's really important here is to note that it's actually, these relationships are reciprocal and mutually reinforcing, which means the more conflict you experience in your life between your work and your personal life, the more burnt out you get. And the more burnt out you get, the less resilient you are and the less able you are to cope with your work demands. So the more interference you experience. So you can see how these things actually mutually reinforce one another and potentially get worse over time. Again, a piece of work we did, but a long time ago now. Michelle was involved with this piece of work, and I think we did it in about 2010, but we actually collected data from construction workers on a major infrastructure project on a weekly basis. We asked them to fill out a little weekly log that told us how many hours they'd worked, what was going on, how well they felt they were traveling in terms of their work-life balance, how well they were traveling in terms of capacity to complete tasks at home and at work. And you can see here, the blue line represents work hours. So from week 13, where it goes down quite steeply, up to week 17, there's a very steep rise in work hours. Now, what was happening on the project at this time is that week 17, there was a major milestone. It was a big part of the project was due for completion. I think media were coming out. There was going to be a big ceremony to sort of recognize this completion of this major milestone in this project. Now, what happened before that, you can see people's work hours dramatically rose on average. But the interesting thing about this is the orange and the yellow lines show their capacity to complete tasks at home and their satisfaction with their work-life balance. And that plummeted, so that fell away in almost a mirror image of this increase in work hours. And I guess what this tells us is that projects are not static, they have rhythms. Construction projects have rhythms. And we do know that there are peak periods of high intensity work that need to be considered in terms of the effects that can potentially have on people's health. Next slide, please. And this is what people wrote in the little diaries that we were asking them to fill out at this time. They were telling us that crisis rectification and crisis resolution leads to emotional strain. Things change regularly, hourly, daily. My job is very reactive and stressful. That came from a supervisor. And an engineer working on this project at that time, particularly that time between week 13 and 17, said, as usual, I've got too much to do. There are not enough hours in the week. Time flies by. You look at what you meant to achieve at the end of the day. You carry most of it over to the next day. I came into work at 4 a.m. to get ahead on work. I guess what this is telling us is that people are simply not having enough time to recover between shifts. So coming in at 4 a.m., they're clearly not having enough time to recover. And we looked at this in terms of the effort recovery relationship. There's a theory about effort and recovery whereby if you expend effort at work, you need time to recover. And if you don't have enough time to recover, then when you go back to do your next work shift, you have to expend even more energy to achieve the same amount of work. So insufficient recovery ultimately, again, will lead to this downward spiral effect where energy is ultimately depleted, and it's not sustainable and will result in long-term health and also potentially safety consequences. Next slide, please. So am I talking this with? I am, Michelle, and I'm covering this as well. So one of the things that's happened in the Australian construction industry in recent years is that the industry's banded together in a group, a task force that was formed with government agencies and large construction companies, and indeed some academics, including Michelle and I and others, in this Culture in Construction initiative. Next slide, please. So, and what the Culture and Construction Task Force set out to do was to try and create a new standard for work in the construction industry that would address some of the significant cultural challenges that we know affect people's health and well-being, but also their time for life and gender diversity. So just some statistics about the construction industry, and this is, if you like, the background to why the Culture and Construction Initiative commenced. Again, we've got long work hours. I've just spoken about that. Lack of diversity. We know that construction is the most male-dominated industry in Australia. Only 12% of the workforce are women, and less than 2% of on-site roles are occupied by women. And on the well-being side, we know that there is a significant suicide issue in terms of the suicide rate is 2 times the national average, and we know people report high levels of stress and burnout. So these were the challenges that the Cultural Task Force was actually trying to address. Next slide, please. So the way the Culture Task Force actually addressed these things was to establish a culture standard, and this culture standard sets some clear guidelines. It's a framework that sets guidelines for contractors and clients, organisations to work together to address these issues in the projects that are being delivered. And it talks about inclusivity, targeting diversity, gender pay gaps, flexible work hours, mental health, and all sorts of things. But importantly and relevant to the conversation we're having today, in that bottom right-hand corner, that green box there, it says that all workers should work fewer than 50 hours a week. But if they have to work more than that, nobody should work more than 55 hours a week. And it also says that sites should operate from Monday to Friday, or where this is not viable, demonstrate why and ensure workers are working 5 in 7. So 5-day work week, basically, as opposed to the standard industry 6-day work week. Next slide. So the culture standard is currently being implemented on 5 pilot projects in 2 different states, New South Wales and Victoria, and that involves both vertical and horizontal projects, so building projects and civil engineering projects. And those pilots will run, I think, till the middle of next year, and we're in the process of actually collecting data from those pilots to look at how people are experiencing the culture standard as it is being implemented on those pilot projects. Next slide, please. So I'll hand over now to Michelle, who'll talk a little bit about young workers.
Thank you very much, Helen. We know that young construction workers have particular characteristics which are relevant to their health and well-being. Given their importance, we allocated a whole chapter 8 in our book to this important group, these young workers in construction. But what's not in the book, we'll stay back on the other slide, please, Chris. Thank you. But what's not in the book is some findings that are associated with our recent culture in construction research, which Helen has just referred to. The research that we did explored the most important job characteristics of young workers. The research also explored whether these young workers believed that these important job characteristics will be available to them in construction. And this research is important because it can help us to understand how we can attract young workers into the industry and retain them. And I know in Australia, we've got a very serious shortfall of workers. So we're trying to find ways to attract these young workers into construction. So in terms of the trainees, again, that's some of the research that we did as part of our program of works with culture and construction. We chatted to trainees. Now they undertake a 2-year structured program They participate in 3 8-month rotations. They spend time in a client organisation, and in this case, it's a government department in the state of New South Wales. They spend 8 months with a consultant organisation, a designer organisation often, and a construction organisation, and all of the trainees have completed Year 12. After they'd spent some time with rotations, we asked the trainees to rate the 24 job characteristics according to how important each one of them is and whether they thought these job characteristics would be available in construction. We also asked them whether they intended to stay in construction after their traineeship program had finished. Thanks, Chris. Next slide. So what you can see here is a spider diagram, and I just mentioned the 24 characteristics. So in this diagram, the blue line equals the importance when choosing a career, and the orange line tells us whether the perceived availability in construction for these trainees. So these are the trainees who have decided to pursue a career in construction. When we consider the blue and orange lines, you can see that they're fairly closely aligned for those trainees. So again, the job characteristics that they think are important are likely to be available in construction. So I think that looks pretty good. So we go to the next slide, please. Now, for trainees who were either undecided or had definitely chosen not to pursue a career in construction, the diagram looks a little different. So again, the blue line shows the importance when choosing a career, and the orange line is whether they're likely to be available in construction. So for the trainees who are either undecided or have chosen not to pursue a career in construction, we can see a sizable gap between those job characteristics considered important and whether they'll be available in construction. So just draw your attention to a couple where there was the biggest importance availability gap. So for, you can see they're numbered. So for number 1, so that's having a job that's enjoyable. Number 18, having a job that provides control over working time. Number 19, having work hours that don't interfere with their non-work roles and interests. And also job characteristic 20, having a job that enables a healthy lifestyle. Interestingly, Helen and I had a look at these results, and it's very clear to us that these job characteristics, where the big gap is, are all clearly linked to health and well-being in some way. And I suppose, going back to how we can use the findings, I suppose it's what they can do is help us to understand how we can attract young workers into the industry and retain them. And I think again, it comes back to culture, how we can shape a culture that's attractive for these young workers, and they're going to, they'll nurture and thrive. Thanks, Chris. Next slide. Now I'm going to move into gender, as Helen said, with a particular emphasis on women in construction. So we actually have a whole chapter on women's health and construction, chapter 5 in our book. And we also touch on working time, chapter 4, where we think we consider the gender nature of work hours and health. Thanks, Chris. Next slide. Helen mentioned earlier work hours generically. Now I'm sort of looking at work hours from a gender lens. We know that work hours impact on the mental health of work for both men and women, but in a different way. So the tipping point for women is actually 34 hours, while it's 47 hours for men. After 34 or 47 hours, women and men will expect to experience negative impacts on their mental health. And this 13-hour difference means that the average Australian man can work 13 hours more each week before, more than the average Australian woman, before there's a negative impact on their mental health. And there's been some terrific research to understand why this is the case, and explained in terms of the fact that women are more likely to combine paid work with unpaid care and domestic work. So in this regard, long work hours therefore serve to reinforce traditional gender roles and the division of labour between paid work and care. Now, we know that in construction, there's rigid work schedules, there's often lack of flexibility, start times and finish times, days of work, perhaps even location of work, and there's an expectation of long work hours. And all of these factors combined really preclude women from working in construction once they have a family, and particularly once they start caring for dependent age children. If these women do stay in construction, they are often overlooked for promotion because they cannot prioritise work over everything else, which is often the expectation in construction. And in our research, we've also found that women who do return to work after giving birth often come back to lower paid jobs and work part-time. Thanks, Chris. I'll now move into some gendered work hazards, again, focusing on women. There's been some terrific research done in Australia and actually around the world to illustrate that often women experience verbal and physical harassment and discrimination. They're often objectified, belittled, ignored, ostracised and silenced. Now, I've popped up these quotes just to illustrate from the voice of women what occurs. So the first quote here is, when I told a subcontractor off for setting up a mobile crane without safety checks, the site manager pulled me aside and told me to watch the way I speak to people and asked if I was on my period. Again, that's very, very much objectifying, belittling this person. And the second quote, this research was carried out by myself and another colleague a few years ago. It's quite recent. I had guys hiding in scaffolds watching me work. To them, it may seem harmless, but when there's one of you and there's 1,000 of them, it probably just does put a bit of a crazy thought in the back of your mind. And again, there's plenty of quotes to illustrate just how at ease women feel when they experience this kind of behaviour. But it has been tough. I'm just looking at time, so let's move on. In our book, we also refer to workplaces designed for women. We call out poorly fitting PPEs an occupational health hazard for women. We know that that's certainly an occupational hazard for women in high risk workplaces, including construction. What the experts say, often the ergonomists, they say women are not smaller versions of men, so size of clothing, equipment designed for the male body does not fit well. And we know if PPE is not a good fit, it can interfere with the use of tools and operation of equipment. So things like getting sleeves caught in machinery and having limited mobility due to ill-fitting PPE. But there has been some great work done on designing PPE for the body of a woman. So we're moving in a good direction there. Tools and equipment are commonly designed for the male body. For example, handle size and tool weight are designed to accommodate the size and strength of men, yet the average hand length of woman is 0.8 inches shorter than the average man, and so their grip strength averages 2/3 the power of man's grip. This can lead to injury for women, such as musculoskeletal injuries for them. I move into reproductive hazards. There are reproductive hazards on construction sites, such as lead and other chemicals, which are an issue for all workers, we know, but especially for pregnant women. Controlling exposure to these chemicals is really important, and also prolonged standing during pregnancy is associated with premature birth, and strenuous activities such as lifting and climbing can be a hazard for the later stages of pregnancy. So some serious issues to really think about. And I think, Helen just talked about at the start about this idea of designing work that's safe for men and for women. Thanks, Chris. Next slide. So it is important to create a safe and inclusive workplace for women. And I did some research a little while ago and chatted to some of my new graduates who had just moved out of university into construction, and this really struck me, this quote, so I'll read it out. The first day I started a construction company, I was told to remove my second name off my helmet and my hard hat because of harassment online. So I removed that off my helmet, and that was like, oh my goodness, what have I stepped into? So she was quite shocked. She was really excited to start her career in construction. On her first day, she wondered whether she'd done the right thing. And we know that often women are discouraged from entering construction due to the treatment they are likely to receive from men. This treatment often has negative impacts on women's health and well-being. Now, if we are going to encourage women to enter construction, we must create a safe place for them. It's both legally and ethically, it's the right thing to do. Helen just described the Culture in Construction initiative, in which gender is one of the central elements. And there's been some really terrific progress to date, but we still do have some work to do. Thanks, I'll finish there and I'll hand over to Helen to go through sense of place.
Thanks, Michelle. Okay, so as you said, Michelle, and I think this is one of the things that we wanted to communicate in the book, that it's really important to create workplaces where the risks of health impacts are managed appropriately and eliminated where possible, reduced. However, one of the other things that's become of interest to us is aside from that, in addition to reducing risk, can we actually look at designing workplaces that actually produce a positive outcome for health and well-being? I promote health and well-being. And we came across in a project we did with a large infrastructure project in Victoria here, we came across this concept of a sense of place. A sense of place has been used in community and environmental kind of psychology type disciplines to actually look at the extent to which people feel connected to a place, to a physical place, and the extent to which that affects positively their health and well-being. It's often used to look at neighborhoods and communities and suburbs and things like that. However, we started to sort of wonder whether can we use this concept in construction? We know projects are very often very transient. People come and go in projects, and people might not feel connected with the people they're working with, or even know them very well. And there's all sorts of tensions and conflicts in many construction work environments. And so we started to think about what would a positive sense of place look like in a construction project. You can have the next slide, please, Chris. Some definitions here of drawing on this positive psychology approach, I should say. So positive psychology looks at workers' well-being as being more than the absence of depressive symptoms. It's actually talking about how do we promote a general state of well-being and a positive state of life satisfaction. So that's really where we were coming from in this sense of place research. Next slide, please, Chris. So the sense of place describes a perception of people's perceptions of the place in connection with the qualities and attributes that distinguish a place from others. And it gives that place a sense of authenticity and induces feelings of attachment and belonging. So that's really what other people have said sense of place is. And the research shows that is actually linked to quality of life, health and well-being. So as I said, we asked what that might look like in a construction project environment. And after a fairly extensive literature review, we came up with these 6 things. We sort of talked about, okay, it's having a sense of being part of a community, it's being engaged, it's being in a respectful work environment. Michelle's talked about the importance of that already. It's being able to have life balance, it's feeling supported, and it's feeling that you're in a workplace where organizations support you in resources that you need to be resilient to stressful things that might be occurring around you. Next slide, please. So what we did was we actually developed a tool to measure sense of place as part of our research project, but this tool's actually been adopted, funnily enough, in a New Zealand organization to look at measuring sense of place in construction projects. So we've done some surveys now and found that this is a fairly standard across all the projects we've looked at. This is a fairly standard pattern in the findings. We measured in this work positive mental well-being using an instrument called the Warwick Edinburgh Mental Wellbeing Scale, the short form of that. And what that measures is a lot of measures of mental health research tend to focus on measuring depression and anxiety and adverse conditions, whereas we specifically wanted to focus on, let's look at positive well-being. So we chose this specific measure to do that. And then we measured each of the components of our sense of place model using demonstrated, validated, reliable instruments. And so this data shows we were able to, using population norm scores, break the construction workers down into groups of people who reported high well-being, medium well-being, and low well-being using the instrument that I just explained. And this graph shows for each of the components of the sense of place, how people in low, medium, and high groups were distributed. And for all of these components, with the exception of co-worker support, there was a statistically significant difference in all of these components, as I said, except co-worker support, between people who were in the low well-being, medium well-being, and high well-being groups. And that effect size was large in everything except co-worker support. So what that tells us is that if you're in a workplace which is characterized by these components, you're more likely to report, at least, that you have high well-being compared to low well-being. So we think this is actually quite a useful instrument to support construction project management teams to really think about the work environment that they're providing, and think about how they can create a work environment that is supportive of workers' health as opposed to likely to be harmful to workers' health and well-being. Next slide. I think that's it. Finished. Thank you.
Lovely. I'll just stop sharing there for a minute. Yeah, thanks. And I guess look, I've read through the book, and I know that you've really just touched on a couple of particular sort of interest areas we had that we asked you, but there's just so much richness in there, and I'd sort of again encourage anybody who hasn't got a copy yet to look it up, and also to share it with your construction health and safety management colleagues as well, because in a way it's not often that we get everything packaged up so nicely for us, that explains recent research in a way that we can easily digest, which is really the point, I guess. So congratulations on that. Now, look, we've got a couple of questions coming through, which is great. But I did also just wanted to start off perhaps with a more general question that I did pick up from your book. And there was an impression there that, you know, work-related health and disease is the poor cousin often to occupational safety, and potentially also mental health as well, because we've had I guess, resurgence in mental health, or an increase in mental health awareness in New Zealand over the last couple of years with mates and other things coming into the market, which is great. But why do you think that work-related health and diseases has been traditionally that sort of poor cousin and not talked about or realised so much? Have you got any views on that?
Yeah, look, I'll have a go. I think you're right in saying it is a poor cousin. There's a quote that we often cite from somebody in the construction industry in the UK who famously, as a health and safety director on a major project, said we shout safety, but we whisper health. And I think that's true. And I think it's possibly because it's more complex, it's more difficult to deal with. It's different to safety in the sense that safety occurs within the site hoardings, whereas health can be affected by things outside of work as well as things that happen in the workplace. So it makes it much more difficult to understand, you know, how to deal with issues. Your comments about the mental health is interesting as well, because I agree with you that while there is a lot of focus now on mental health, a lot of awareness about mental health in the construction industry, and some really amazing programs like the MATES program, my concern is that often those programs are actually about helping people to deal with mental health issues once they've actually occurred. I do think we haven't done quite so well in the prevention space yet, and I think that's probably something that needs to be focused on. I think that there needs to be a more of a, okay, how do we actually prevent people from experiencing these things, rather than, you know, just have the programs that are secondary programs that support people. An analogy that somebody in the industry I know well uses is, he says, in safety, if we want to prevent someone from falling into a hole, we either cover up the hole or we put a fence around it so somebody can't fall into the hole. Whereas in mental health, what we see is people fall in the hole and then we pull them out. We try and pull them out. And I think, you know, the analogy is we need to find better risk controls to actually prevent that harm occurring in the first place. But I don't know, Michelle might have something to add on to that.
No, I think you've covered off that nicely. And I think the new ISO standards talks to that, doesn't it, Helen? This idea of rather than helping the sick, helping people not to get sick by job design, redesign.
I think that it leads into Kevin's question that he asked very early on, so good on you, Kevin. Helen, I know that the amount of working hours in construction can be long and dominated by industrial agreements. In my opinion, government clients could require safe and healthy work hours in their tenders. Why don't they? I mean, is that part of the culture standard? Is that where that's going?
Yes, it is. In fact, all of the pilot projects are government projects. So as part of establishing those pilot projects, companies tendered on a 5-day week and agreed to implement the culture standard, i.e. cap work hours, as part of that. And I fully agree with you that this clients determine project timelines and make really important decisions that influence the way the industry works. And there's at the end of these pilot projects, we don't, we're collecting data from the pilot projects to see how they're going and how they're traveling. That will go on till mid next year. But the Culture and Construction Task Force, are advocating that the culture standard would potentially become part of government procurement processes, subject to the pilots, providing evidence that this actually does in fact produce benefits for people. So I think that's the expectation, and that's possibly something that will happen in the future. But certainly the pilot projects that are currently running, they were from very early on in the tender stage set up as 5-day week projects with a cap on working hours.
We've got Mikhail asking a question here. I think it's directed at yourself, Michelle, around the spider charts and differences between the trainees who did and did not choose the construction career. Thinking about latent socioeconomic issues that may be influencing self-selection into the industry and be an indicator of the overall health and well-being. Did you collect any data on socioeconomic background of who chose or did not choose construction and how that might affect entry into the industry? And if not, what do you think about that as an issue of those who select work in construction versus those who opt out of the industry? It's a long question, but maybe you can provide some insight into that.
That we didn't ask that question, so I can't comment on that. But I do know that it was a New South Wales government-led initiative, and they were very careful in their selection of the trainees. They sought to help out those trainees from different socio-economic groups. There was also folks from country and city, so there was quite a diverse mix of folks. But I don't know that I can really answer that question, and I guess I don't want to guess either. Helen, did you have any thoughts on that?
Not really. We do know that they did, as Michelle said, try to select those trainees carefully, and they put a lot of emphasis on trying to select a diverse cohort. And so there was, in that study we had 50% women, didn't we? Which was unusual for a construction cohort. And there were some interesting, findings in that the women and the men in the cohort both valued similar things, work characteristics. So, we didn't find significant differences really between what young women and what young men want from a career. So yes, but we don't really know too much about the demographics other than that. So probably can't say too much more.
Mark's actually raised a good question here as well. And one of the again, it's around working hours and potentially one of the barriers around the trade-off sweet spot between having shorter hours to have a work-life balance versus people actually just needing more work hours due to cost of living. So, if you are going to go down the shorter working hour days, but you might find some resistance there because people are often paid by the hour and can't afford to have their pay reduced. Has that been factored in at all to the...
Look, it's very much part of the conversation. It's obviously very important because you don't want, to implement something that has unintended consequences. On the pilot projects, what I can say is that we've done some surveys as well as a lot of interviews now. The survey data is telling us that the majority of waged workers prefer the shorter work week and the 5-day week on the pilot project. So most of the people for whom their income would potentially be impacted, i.e. the people who are paid as a wage rather than a salary, most of them prefer or indicate a preference for the reduced hours and the 5-day week. What's actually quite interesting as well, and there are some case studies on the Culture in Construction website, which I'd encourage people to have a look at. The projects have been quite creative in how they reorganize the scheduling of work. And certainly they've done so, which is in a way that's very mindful of the impact on waged workers. And on one of the pilot projects, which again, there's a case study on the website, they've reorganized the work schedule in a way that has minimal impact on the take-home pay of workers, because they've extended working hours, for example, during the 5 days they are working, and then eliminated the Saturday week and done various other things that are fairly creative. And what they've ended up doing is ensuring that the reduction in pay for the workers on that job is quite small, and for that they actually have a reasonably large number of additional days off over the course of the working year. So, you know, these things are they're a trade-off, and they do need to be thought about very carefully. And what I think the pilot projects are doing nicely is testing out the different models, because all the pilots have implemented slightly different work scheduling arrangements. And sometimes they've been driven by, you know, the type of the project it is. If it's a rail project, for example, and they have to close down railway lines, then there are certain things that, you know, that they have to do at certain times to do work around those occupations and things. So each of the projects has actually adopted a slightly different work schedule. And what we're now able to do is to look at what is working best across those pilots, and look at the different impacts, including the impacts on pay, because it's critical that those trade-offs are understood, and people are able to be happy. We are finding on some of the projects, and Michelle, you might want to add something here. On some of the projects, we're finding some of the waged workers, so while the majority are saying they're quite happy under the modified work time arrangements, a minority are saying they would prefer to continue working a 6-day week and work longer hours. The people who are saying that tend to be the young workers, so they tend to be the people who don't have family, and you know they're in that younger demographic. And on some sites, people are saying to us that we'd still like the option of working Saturdays, but we'd like it to be optional, not compulsory. So there are different demographics in the workforce as well, and different preferences. And I think one of the things that we need to really be mindful of in these sorts of things is to not be too prescriptive and assume a one size fits all, because it just doesn't.
Well, one last question from Kevin, and I might be a little bit out of scope here, but I think I can help. He's talked about some research in the US that indicates that work-related suicides are not always connected to mental health. Does Australia and New Zealand have this differentiation? Are suicide prevention strategies in construction dominated by mental health strategies, where more effective non-psych strategies may be available? I know in my other hat, I'm also a director at MATES, and I've been working with MATES in New Zealand over 3 years now. And I know they promote themselves as a suicide prevention organisation rather than a mental health organisation. And they will be the first to talk about the fact that there's many factors. It's a multi-factor problem when people get to that stage. But of course, you know, their needs in terms of suicide prevention are multi-factor as well, depending on what's going on with that individual. So it's a complex area. But did you have any views around that yourselves?
Michelle,
maybe I can hand that to you, psychologist.
Yeah, look, yeah, that's sure. No, it has come up in our research quite a lot, and some of the research Helen and I were doing a little while ago, I was actually doing some interviews, primarily with folks, trades and semi-skilled from on site, and they put their hand up and said they talked to me after hours because it was too hard to talk during hours. So that particular research was wanting to explore the impact of physical pain on mental health. So the questions are very much about physical pain and how does it impact your mood and that kind of thing. And often wasn't it to the end of the of the interview as well. I said, thank you, I've asked all my questions. Is there anything else you'd like to add? And, you know, on more than one occasion, this idea of mental health was raised. And, you know, they were saying to me, this is the issue of, you know, that this is the issue of the time, this mental health. And on more than one occasion too, I recall one young chap told me that one of his mates had just committed suicide 4 days ago. You know, they say there's still a real stigma around mental health. There's a real stigma if they're having suicidal thoughts. There's also acknowledgement by the men that I've spoken to that don't feel comfortable talking about weakness or when they're looking for help. So that's also been raised just recently through our research, Helen, with the CICT, this idea of men not feeling comfortable in their help seeking and wanting to show weakness. So, well, I know it's a very specialised area, and we're very much focused on mental health and the way the design of work is. But I think the culture of construction, if we can change it in a way that work is not designed to harm people, that will help. And also to really engender this idea of being open and it's okay to ask for help. Would you add anything, Helen?
Yeah, well, I'd only add, and it's slightly off topic, it doesn't necessarily answer the question that Chris asked, but it's worth noting because it's an important thing. In that bodily pain and mental health study that we did, the work the participant who told us about the suicide of his friend, which had happened, you know, not long before the interview that you did, Michelle, he described that as being partly related to his friend suffering from a back injury at work and being unable to work and becoming socially disconnected as a result, and losing, in his opinion, his friend lost his sort of sense of self-worth and purpose, and it was you know, the worker who we interviewed, the interview participant, described this as being, you know, partly attributable to a physical injury that had happened in the workplace. So it is very, very complex. And I think one of the things that we often do in health and wellbeing research is treat physical and mental health as though they're separate things when they're inextricably linked as well.
Thank you very much. Look, I think we'll finish up there. And I'd just like to firstly thank you both for giving us your time. I know you're very busy. You've got other things going on in Australia at the moment, and some important sessions coming up in the next month at the World Congress in Sydney. I would also encourage everybody, as I said, have a look at the book. I guess, you know, having 40 or 50 minutes on it doesn't really do it justice, but thank you for your attempt at that today. It's a really rich resource. We will put links on our website where you can get it, and we will also include a recording of the webinar and the presentation on our website, and also if there are any other resources or anything like that that are relevant to it. We'll also look at answering some of the questions that we weren't able to answer today within the given time, and that will be available probably mid next week, usually by the time we get processing the video. So really just signing off. If you'd like to sign off, Helen and Michelle, and thank you very much.
Thanks very much for the invitation. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.